Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about the neighbor who sold my house. I was standing in my older sister's hospital room in a foreign country, one I'd traveled to on short notice because she'd gone into a deep coma, and the whole world felt disjointed. The letter had arrived for me via special delivery from an acquaintance in my neighborhood back in the United States. I was exhausted, worried, and a bit numb from the endless days of monitoring my sister's fragile condition. She was hooked up to so many machines that the constant beeping became my lullaby every night. I'd only been getting a couple of hours of sleep at best, often drifting off in an upright chair with a paper cup of cold coffee growing stale by my side. My life was consumed by anxiety over whether she'd ever wake up. Her doctor suggested that the best care for her specific situation was only available at this clinic, so I had no choice but to remain in this place indefinitely. Even in the midst of that stress, I tried to keep up with basic tasks back home, paying bills, checking emails, ensuring my property wasn't falling apart. My neighbor Karen had kindly offered to look after my garden, water the plants, and keep an eye on the mail. I still remember her wide smile when I asked her to do me that favor, especially since I was in a hurry to catch the next available flight. At the time, I believed I was leaving my home in good hands. Karen lived right next door, and I'd known her for a while. We weren't close friends, but we'd exchanged friendly greetings many times. She seemed pleasant enough. She loved gardening, and she sometimes stopped by to show me clippings of rare flowers she wanted to grow. Because of that shared interest, I thought she'd take pride in caring for my vegetable beds and my collection of ornamental plants. Also, she occasionally made references to her own greenhouse and how she'd wanted to expand it one day, so I figured she truly enjoyed anything related to plants. Because I had no time to go through the usual formalities, I gave Karen a key to the outer gate so she could access the grounds and do her gardening work. I had seen no harm in that. The entrance to my property had two layers: first the tall wrought iron gate that led into the garden area, then the front door that actually opened into the house. She did not have a key to my house, which I thought was both prudent and respectful of my privacy. At least, that's what I believed at the time. Then came those long months in the foreign hospital, holding my sister's hand, combing her hair, and hoping for any sign of improvement. My sister had always been a pillar of strength in my life, so seeing her unconscious was agonizing. I gave up my job temporarily, requested a leave of absence, and devoted my time solely to being there for her. My finances were precarious, but I had some savings, plus her insurance covered many of her treatments. Still, it was no small feat to maintain my mortgage, my utilities, and everything else while half a world away. The letter came unexpectedly one afternoon. One of my neighbors, someone I hadn't spoken to in a long time, somehow discovered my temporary mailing address and sent me a typed letter. It was short, but impossible to misunderstand. "I've heard from a reliable source that your house is up for sale. What's going on? If you need help, let me know." At first, I shrugged it off as some misunderstanding. Maybe my neighbor saw a for sale sign that was meant for another house and got confused. However, I took the letter seriously enough to respond by phone, using the number scrawled at the bottom. That's when I learned that an actual sign had been planted on my front lawn, listing a local real estate agent's details, and apparently, the house was being shown to potential buyers that very week. I felt my head spin with confusion. Did my mortgage company make a mistake? Had I accidentally defaulted on some payment? But I'd been meticulous about paying my bills. Then I started to think, maybe there was a scam going on, or someone was using my vacant property for shady reasons. With that revelation, I launched into a frenzy of phone calls. I contacted the mortgage lender, my bank, the local property records office, anyone I could think of who might clarify how my house could possibly be on the market without my knowledge. Time differences made it difficult, but I'd stay awake all night to call during American business hours. It became an exhausting cycle. Sit with my sister all day, help with her physical therapy, talk to doctors, then stay awake all night making phone calls to the United States, trying to piece together a puzzle that should never have existed in the first place. One person told me that the property's deed had been transferred to another name, some obscure limited liability company. Another insisted that my house had a legitimate listing agreement signed under my own name. Obviously, it was not me who had done any of this. I had left the country on an emergency basis and had no interest in selling my property. All these contradictory pieces of information only fueled my panic. I found a local attorney who specialized in property disputes and flew back and forth in short bursts, though it was detrimental to my sister's care. My sister's condition was too serious for me to be away for long, but I had to make sure I didn't lose my property. I would visit the US for a couple of days, try to gather evidence, and then rush back to the foreign hospital, terrified my sister might wake up alone or face some crisis without me. On one of these short trips back home, I walked up to my driveway and saw, to my horror, that everything looked different. My usually well-kept garden was half uprooted. Some of my shrubs had been dug out. A sold sign stood in the yard, and the real estate agent's information was plastered across it in large, bright lettering. I felt like I'd stepped into an alternate reality. I confronted the agent's office immediately. The agent denied wrongdoing, claiming all the paperwork was in order and that I, supposedly me, had come in person to sign all the required documents. Needless to say, my real signature was never on those documents. Someone had forged it, and the scrawled signature in the file was such a sloppy attempt at my name that I was shocked no one in that office flagged it as suspicious. But the agent insisted that everything had been notarized properly, so from their perspective it all looked legitimate. I was shell-shocked. I dug into how that notary seal was obtained. Turned out someone had walked in with what looked like a driver's license in my name, filled out the forms, and the notary simply didn't think to question anything further. I was left speechless at the lack of diligence. My next step was to file a legal complaint, demanding an immediate stop to the sale. I had to go through the county clerk's office, showing them the proof that I was out of the country during the alleged sale. I handed over my passport stamps, my plane tickets, the letters from the hospital. I asked them to place a freeze on the property's title while the matter was resolved. They did so, but it was not a quick or easy process. Then came the question, who orchestrated this? And that's where Karen's name came up. At first, I had no suspicion directed at her. Even though she was the only one with consistent access to my property, I assumed that gave her some level of trust. Unfortunately, that assumption was naive. What started as a quiet suspicion turned into a full-blown realization when I discovered that Karen's house, right next door, was also on the market. Hers had a big sign with the same real estate agent. Apparently, she had told the agent she was looking to sell quickly because she had plans to move abroad. I thought, well, maybe she's just decided to relocate. Yet it felt odd that both properties went on sale around the same time and that the official paperwork for both had the same mysterious notary. Something was definitely amiss. Still, I kept an open mind. Perhaps Karen was just selling her own house and had no idea about what was happening with mine. She'd always seemed like a friendly, if somewhat nosy, neighbor. But as I dug further, I noticed a bizarre detail. The same forged signature that appeared on my deed transfer also appeared on a power of attorney document that authorized the sale of my house. That bogus document had Karen's signature as a witness, along with an additional witness named Miriam, who, as far as I knew, didn't exist in my circle of acquaintances. Confronted with these improbable coincidences, I started to suspect that Karen had orchestrated the whole scheme. But how had she gotten into my house to stage it for showings? My front door was locked tightly and I had not given her a key, but I soon learned from a friend in the neighborhood that Karen had summoned a locksmith, claiming she was a caretaker who had accidentally locked herself out of her client's home. She presented false documents to the locksmith, who, not wanting a confrontation, simply changed the locks for her. Now she had full access. The more I discovered, the more enraged I became. My home, the place I'd worked tirelessly to buy, was being trotted out to prospective buyers as if it were just another piece of merchandise, and Karen was the puppet master behind it all. Unfortunately, by the time I pieced this all together, Karen was gone. She had vanished shortly after the sale of both her property and mine was finalized on paper. The money from those sales, mine included, was presumably in her bank account. It wasn't until I pressed charges, alerted the police, and got the FBI involved, since this crossed into potential international fraud, that I realized how extensive her plan had been. She'd apparently sold her house, which she legally owned, and combined that sale with the fraudulent sale of my property. Then she hopped on a plane to another country. The police told me it might be difficult to locate her quickly, but they put her on a watch list and flagged her passport with the authorities. Meanwhile, I had a massive fight on my hands. The buyer who thought they legally owned my house was furious, claiming they'd put down a substantial down payment. They demanded the right to move in, but from my perspective, none of this was legal. They had bought stolen property in essence. Their anger, while understandable, wasn't my fault. Nonetheless, We ended up entangled in a complicated legal proceeding. My attorney argued that the entire sale was invalid due to fraud. The buyer's attorney argued that they were innocent and had every right to claim the property. The real estate agent tried to deflect blame onto the notary. The notary insisted they followed standard procedures. And the mortgage company was panicking because they saw that my property was in limbo, and my ongoing payments needed to be directed properly. It was a tangled web with multiple parties pointing fingers, culminating in an atmosphere of chaos. During this stressful time, my sister's condition began to deteriorate. The doctors said it was partly the unpredictability of her injuries and partly the stress on me. They gently reminded me that my presence mattered. For a few weeks, I was traveling back and forth, trying to juggle both crises, my sister's health and my property. I hired a family friend to help me keep tabs on the legal developments at home so that I could focus more on my sister's care in that foreign country. But I'll never forget the feeling of betrayal that seeped into my every waking moment. Karen, the neighbor I had trusted with my garden, the neighbor to whom I gave access purely for the sake of watering my tomatoes and trimming my roses, had taken advantage of my dire situation. It was unconscionable. As luck would have it, about 3 months after the fraudulent sale was discovered, Karen made a grave mistake. She attempted to enter the United States again, perhaps to handle some unfinished business, or maybe to retrieve personal items. The authorities were alerted thanks to the complaint I'd filed and the watch placed on her passport. She was apprehended at the airport. My attorney and I were immediately informed, and I finally felt a glimmer of hope that justice might be served. The district attorney took the case seriously, especially since the evidence against Karen was overwhelming. There were emails from her account scheduling showings, references in her bank statements to large unexplained deposits, copies of the fake power of attorney, and the testimony of the locksmith who recognized her. Karen was placed under arrest and bail was set higher than I expected. She managed to pay it, which astonished everyone. That sparked rumors that she'd squirreled away a huge sum of money from the fraudulent sale of my house. Because she clearly had the resources, the court considered her a flight risk. They restricted her from leaving the state. She was forced to live with a relative, someone who seemed shocked by her actions, while the case went through the legal process. I ended up testifying in court through video conferencing at first because I was still out of the country. My sister had finally regained consciousness, but her recovery was slow and she needed constant care. When the prosecutors arranged for the trial date, I flew back again, torn between relief that my sister was improving and anxiety over leaving her so soon. The trial was surreal. Karen sat there in a tidy dress, looking for all the world like a confused woman who had no idea why she was there. She attempted to pin the blame on an unknown accomplice, claiming she had been deceived as well. She said that a friend of hers, this imaginary Miriam, misled her with the promise of a joint business venture, and that the sale of my house was somehow authorized. Her story didn't hold up under scrutiny, particularly when the prosecution presented email threads that originated from her personal email address. In one of those emails, she bragged about securing a sweet deal by combining 2 properties into one package. She wrote that she was selling the place next door and that the owner, referring to me, would never know the difference. That email alone sealed her fate in many ways. It was a blatant admission. When the attorneys cross-examined her about it, she stuttered through incomplete explanations, none of which made sense. The process wasn't just about Karen's criminal punishment. There was also the matter of my property rights. The judge had to determine if the buyer had any legitimate claim. The final ruling was that the sale was entirely void, because it had been founded on fraud from the start. The money the buyer had paid was to be recovered from Karen, or rather, from the remains of her bank accounts. That triggered a separate civil lawsuit, which the buyer eventually won against Karen. But whether or not they would ever see a dime of that money was uncertain. Meanwhile, the district attorney's office pursued criminal charges: fraud, forgery, and grand larceny. Karen was convicted, and although she tried to flee again after the sentencing, she was caught within the same week, apparently attempting to cross into another country by land. She ended up with a 5-year prison sentence. It might seem short given the magnitude of her wrongdoing, but the judge gave her the maximum allowable for the specific charges that stuck. While the criminal trial advanced, there were other strange developments. A group of investors who had bought Karen's home argued that she had left the place in disarray. They insisted that they discovered hidden compartments in the basement containing odd documents, some referencing other suspicious transactions. It turned out Karen might have engaged in smaller-scale fraud for years. Her scamming spree reached beyond just my property. It was bigger than I ever imagined. That revelation compelled the authorities to dig deeper into her background. But the 5-year prison term remained the official punishment on record. Prosecutors hinted that more charges might be filed if further victims came forward. But for now, I was content that at least she was behind bars and out of my life. Meanwhile, my sister's recovery back in the foreign hospital finally took a turn for the better. She started speaking in short phrases, recognized me, and was soon able to move her arms and legs. The doctors recommended an extended rehabilitation program before she could safely be transported back to the United States. That meant I had to stay a little longer in that foreign country. But at least the stress of the fraud case was starting to subside. Knowing Karen was facing justice allowed me to sleep more peacefully, free from fear that she'd attempt another stunt with my property. The aftermath of the ordeal was complicated. Even though the courts declared the sale of my house void, I still had to deal with the tangled mess of title insurance, the outraged buyer, and the fact that some damages had been done to the property itself. Karen had trashed parts of my home when staging it, possibly to cover up any evidence of her presence, or to discourage me from stepping in too soon. I had to spend thousands of dollars repairing flooring, repainting walls, and restoring the garden that I had entrusted to Karen. The backyard, once teeming with flowers, vegetables, and fruit trees, looked more like a neglected field. It broke my heart to see it, but I channeled my anger into the process of rebuilding. An unexpected silver lining came when neighbors saw what I was going through and decided to form a little volunteer group. Some of them came over with gardening tools, seeds, and plants, helping me re-establish my beloved garden. One neighbor, whose name is Jean, introduced me to a local horticulture club that donated a variety of seedlings. Another neighbor, who was good with carpentry, helped me repair my gazebo and the fence that Karen apparently had partially knocked down, likely to create a combined open house feel between her yard and mine. Their kindness reminded me that not everyone is like Karen, and that community can step up when someone is in genuine need. While all this was happening, I started receiving random letters from unscrupulous people who had purchased my contact information from who knows where, offering to help me reclaim my property for a fee. Essentially, they wanted me to pay thousands of dollars to fix a problem that had already been solved by the court. It was disheartening to see how quickly vultures circle when they sense vulnerability. I had to block numerous phone calls and email addresses. Eventually, I managed to secure my credit, freeze my accounts, and use an identity theft protection service to prevent further misuse of my personal information. The entire fiasco was a stark lesson in how fragile one's security can be. Meanwhile, I learned more details about Karen's background. People started coming forward with stories of how she'd once run a small pyramid scheme in a nearby town, how she'd borrowed money from friends and never paid it back, or how she'd manipulated older people into giving her personal information. One former co-worker of Karen claimed she was fired years ago after forging the manager's signature on a purchase order. Her pattern of deception stretched back further than I could have guessed. I realized that while I thought she was just a friendly neighbor with a green thumb, she was actually quite practiced in fraud. Perhaps my situation was just the most brazen attempt she'd ever tried. Or maybe it was one of many that just happened to catch up with her. Either way, she wouldn't be repeating it anytime soon. A couple of months after the legal matters began to settle, my sister was well enough to be moved to a specialized rehabilitation center in the United States. I brought her home, though she still needed physical therapy and frequent doctor's visits. I took a part-time job so I could be her primary caregiver. Though it was tough to cut down on my career ambitions, seeing her regain her independence week by week was worth every sacrifice. When I finally settled back into my own house, I was struck by how foreign it felt. It didn't seem like the cozy haven I'd left behind. The stress of Karen's betrayal lingered, and I couldn't step into certain rooms without remembering that strangers had walked through them, imagining the layout of their future home. For the first month or two, I considered selling it legitimately and moving somewhere else. But deep down, I felt my roots were here. I wasn't going to let Karen steal not just my house, but also the love I had for my home. As for Karen's old property, the new owners tried to introduce themselves to the neighborhood, but there was a swirl of drama around them. They kept complaining about repairs and the lack of accountability they faced from Karen's deals. They sometimes looked at me with suspicion, probably because they were worried I might hold them responsible in some indirect way. But I had no ill will toward them. They had been duped by the same con artist who turned my life upside down. Over time, we exchanged a few cordial greetings, but I kept my distance. The entire scenario had caused too much heartache for me to jump into any new neighborly relationships without caution. The main bright spot remained my sister's recovery. She was slowly regaining her mobility, even managing to take short walks with a walker around my garden. She'd apologized that I had to place my entire life on hold for her, but I assured her that I was actually grateful for a chance to focus on family. The ordeal with Karen taught me that you never know how quickly circumstances can change. I may have lost money, time, and a sense of security, but I gained a stronger understanding of what truly mattered: the well-being of loved ones and the integrity of one's home and life. During the sentencing hearing, I sat in the back of the courtroom and listened as the judge laid out Karen's punishment: 5 years in prison. She would also face fines and be required to pay restitution. Of course, there was no guarantee she'd have enough assets left to pay it. That was a separate battle for the attorneys to figure out. Karen showed no remorse. She stood there, eyes glazed, occasionally biting her lip as though she was trapped in a nightmare that she felt was unfair. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, she muttered some vague statements about being framed and repeated her Miriam story. No one bought it. I asked my attorney if it was possible that someone else had pulled the strings. He said it was unlikely, given the evidence. It seemed Karen was the mastermind who took advantage of my absence and my sister's illness. She saw that I was too busy to keep close tabs on my property and found a perfect opening to commit her crime. Perhaps she had done partial research on forging real estate documents and recognized that with the right notary stamp, legitimate or forged, she could slip under the radar. The combined sale of her own home with my house might have been motivated by some twisted plan to disappear abroad and live off the combined profits indefinitely. Yet, justice doesn't always mean immediate or complete closure. I had to live with the outcomes: a house that felt tainted, a sense of personal violation, and the knowledge that I'd never see any significant restitution from Karen. My family had to invest in legal fees, and my sister's medical costs kept piling up. Nevertheless, I was determined not to let cynicism rule my life. I poured my energy into nurturing my newly replanted garden. In a way, gardening became therapy for me. Each day, I'd wake up, put on my gloves, and spend time pruning, watering, and caring for my plants. I realized that each new bloom was a symbol of resilience and life persisting despite the odds. But the saga had more twists. About a year after Karen was incarcerated, a relative of hers reached out. This relative claimed they found an old journal in Karen's belongings that hinted at more hidden assets. They wanted my help in sorting it out, perhaps in exchange for a portion of the money. I immediately forwarded this to my attorney. I didn't want any direct dealings with Karen's family, especially if it involved rummaging through ill-gotten gains. My attorney told me to stay out of it, which I did. If the authorities needed that journal, they would request it. If the family was hoping to benefit from Karen's wrongdoing, then that was up to the courts to decide. I wasn't about to get tangled in more drama. On top of that, the real estate agent who handled the sale of my house was slapped with a hefty penalty by the state's real estate commission. Their license was suspended for failing to verify the identity of the seller properly. I felt a bit of satisfaction when I heard that, not because I delight in someone else's misfortune, but because it meant the system was acknowledging that they had been negligent. If they had done basic due diligence, they might have discovered that the real me was out of the country, that the signature looked off, or that the ID was counterfeit. Instead, they rushed to seal the deal, ignoring red flags. The state imposed fines and required them to undergo additional training before they could practice again, if they ever chose to. The notary's situation was just as severe. The notary lost their commission entirely. It was revealed during court proceedings that they were overworked and often notarized documents without seeing the signers in person. That was a clear violation of notary rules and basic ethics. I received a formal apology letter from their office, though I suspected it was written more out of obligation than genuine remorse. During the entire aftermath, I made a new friend in the detective assigned to my case. He would stop by occasionally to give me updates. We started talking about more personal things, like our shared hobby of fishing. He once joked, "Next time you decide to go out of the country, let me know so I can watch your back." We laughed, but there was a serious undertone. I realized that one of the best ways to protect yourself is to let trusted people know your plans. If you disappear for months and no one knows, it's much easier for a fraudster to exploit your absence. I hoped my experience would encourage others to be more cautious. It took well over a year for all the dust to settle. My house was legally recognized as mine again. The fraudulent deeds were voided, and the updated records were clearly in my name. I spent hours at the recorder's office double-checking that everything was correct. My bank confirmed that my mortgage was fully reinstated, and the buyer who'd been duped received some funds back after freezing Karen's accounts. A portion was still missing, but they had insurance coverage that helped recoup some of their losses. They moved on to another property in a different neighborhood, so I never saw them again. I felt relieved for them, but recognized how lucky I was that the court system worked in my favor. As for Karen, she served her time, at least the portion of it that was mandated before parole could be considered. I followed the updates in the criminal record system. She appealed her sentence twice, but lost. She tried to strike a deal with prosecutors to reduce her prison time, but that also fell flat. When she was finally released on parole, I made sure to get a restraining order that prevented her from ever coming near my property or contacting me again. I knew the odds of her wandering back into my life were slim, but I wasn't taking any chances. Gradually, I settled back into a routine. My sister's health improved to the point where she could live on her own with minimal assistance, so I helped her move into a condo closer to her new physical therapy center. She didn't want to return to the memories of the foreign country where she had been hospitalized for so long. She thanked me often for everything I did, but I always reminded her that family is family, and I'd do anything to ensure her well-being. I also learned a few critical lessons that I still live by. First, never give anyone unnecessary access to your property, even if they seem trustworthy. This doesn't mean living in fear, but verifying references and setting up safeguards is essential. Second, keep detailed records of your travels and whereabouts. Having my plane tickets, passport stamps, and hospital admission notes was crucial in proving I wasn't present for those fraudulent transactions. Third, be extremely vigilant about your identity and keep track of your property records. Regularly check them, even if you think you're safe. Had I not received that tip from my other neighbor, I might have come home one day to find strangers living in my house, and reversing that scenario would have been even more complicated. I also realized that many people want a piece of the action when drama unfolds. Some folks I barely knew started texting me, asking questions, prying into personal details. I learned to set boundaries. Not everyone who's curious about your life has good intentions. These boundaries also extended to my online presence. I locked down my social media, making sure strangers couldn't see when I was leaving the country or what my plans were. I recognized that I'd inadvertently made it easier for Karen by posting updates about my sister's condition and how long I'd be away. While I was naive to trust her, I also gave her too much information that made her con that much simpler. Despite all the heartbreak and stress, I came out of the ordeal with a reinforced sense of who I can count on. Friends who stepped up to help me replant my garden, watch my home, or pass along important information became cherished parts of my support system. It also made me appreciate the law enforcement officials and attorneys who genuinely cared about justice. Sure, the system was slow, and it felt cumbersome at times, but it did eventually bring Karen to account for her crimes. Friends, thank you. See you soon.